In this video we delve into the fascinating and moving story of John Lennon, one of the greatest icons of world music. From his childhood in Liverpool through the height of Beatlemania, to his musical maturity and the release of Imagine, we explore each significant moment of his life. We also talk about his relationship with Yoko Ono, his dedication to fatherhood, his fight for activism and the controversies he faced in New York. Unfortunately, John Lennon's story had a tragic ending, with his assassination on December 8, 1980. But his immortal legacy lives on, inspiring generations with messages of peace, love and change. Imagine being born into a world plunged into the chaos of World War II. That's how John Winston Lennon's story began, on October 9, 1940 in Liverpool, England. As bombs fell from the sky, in a city marked by sirens and shelters, a baby named after the then British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave his first cry. This little boy, without knowing it, was destined to change the world with his music. John was the son of Julia Stanley and Alfred Lennon. His father, a merchant seaman, was away most of the time, and this left a deep impression on the young boy. Alfred was charismatic but fickle and soon disappeared from John's life. Julia, his mother, was a vibrant, fun-loving and lively figure, but she was also not ready to be a present and responsible mother. The lack of stability led John to live with his Aunt Mimi and Uncle George in a simple house at 251 Menlove Avenue, which would later be known to fans as Mendips. Aunt Mimi was a practical and strict woman, the kind who always said, "The guitar is nice, but you'll never make a living at it." However, she gave John something he desperately needed: a home. John's connection to his mother Julia never faded, however. He would visit her often and she played a key role in his musical discovery. Julia was the one who introduced him to the banjo, teaching him his first chords and encouraging his love of music despite his circumstances. At school, John was a typical rebellious boy. He was witty, loved to draw funny caricatures of his teachers, but rarely followed the rules. His mischievous behavior often got him into trouble, but it also revealed a creative and independent side that would one day take him far. Liverpool at the time was a city marked by economic hardship and post-war reconstruction. For young people, music was an escape valve, something that transported them to a different world. It was in this environment that John began to dream. He may not have all the answers, but he knew he wanted something bigger. Something inside him told him that he didn't belong in that simple house or on the streets of Liverpool. John's childhood was not easy, but it was full of moments that shaped his unique personality. He was a mix of contradictions, rebellious and sensitive, playful and melancholic, determined to make his mark on the world. It was around the age of 15 that John discovered the sound that would change his life forever: rock and roll. Songs like Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock and Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel swept through England, bringing a new and electrifying energy. For John, it was as if someone had lit a fire inside him. Rock wasn't just music. It was attitude, it was rebellion, and he wanted to be a part of it. John convinced his mother Julia to buy him his first guitar. It was a simple, inexpensive item, but for him, it was a gateway to a world of possibilities. He would spend hours playing chords and imitating his American idols, absorbing each sound like a sponge. His practical Aunt Mimi would say, "It's just a phase, John." But for him it was just the beginning. In 1956 he decided to turn his passion into something real. That's when he founded his first band, the Quarrymen, named after the school he attended, Quarrybank High School. It was a mix of rock, skiffle, a popular British style of the time, and the awkward enthusiasm of a group of teenagers with big dreams. John wasn't technically the best guitarist or the most in-tune singer, but he had charisma. When he took the stage, you couldn't take your eyes off him. John was a natural leader, but his intense personality sometimes caused conflict within the group. He wasn't easy to get along with a dry sense of humor and a stubborn streak that meant he had his way, or nothing at all. Despite this, the Quarrymen began playing at small parties, weddings and local clubs, gaining experience and, more importantly, visibility. It was an ordinary summer day in 1957, and the Quarrymen, the band led by John Lennon, were performing at a parish event in the garden of St. Peter's Church in Liverpool. For John, it was just another opportunity to play, impress the audience and perhaps draw a little more attention to his skiffle band. He loved being in the spotlight and his charisma was undeniable, even if his guitar skills were still far from perfect. But that day would turn extraordinary when a mutual friend, Ivan Vaughan, brought a young man named Paul McCartney to see the show. Paul, 2 years younger than John, was a shy but talented kid. He watched John's performance intently, noting his confident style and at the same time the sloppy way he played. John's mix of raw energy and unpretentiousness was something that Paul found fascinating. After the show, Ivan introduced the two. Paul, always polite, greeted John and picked up the guitar that one of the band members had left nearby. He adjusted the tuning, something that immediately impressed John, since no one in the band could do it properly. Then Paul began playing and singing Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock, hitting every note and every word with a confidence that made John stop for a moment. A rare thing for him. John, who had always liked to be in control, was torn. On the one hand, he recognized that Paul had raw talent, perhaps even superior to his own. On the other, he felt a twinge of insecurity. But most of all, John knew how to spot potential when he saw it. After a brief conversation, he made the decision that would change their lives forever. He invited Paul to join the Quarrymen. It was a moment of humility and vision, traits that would mark their partnership over the years. The connection between John and Paul was instantaneous, but also fraught with creative tension. John was more impulsive, writing songs that often reflected his mood or his deepest thoughts. Paul, on the other hand, had a more melodic style and a structured approach. Together they complemented each other in a unique way. From the earliest days of their collaboration, it was clear that there was something special about their friendship, something bigger than either of them could have imagined. What's more, the two found something rare in each other, someone who understood their ambitions. They both wanted more than an ordinary life in Liverpool. They wanted to go out, conquer the world, and make their mark. They spent hours composing, experimenting with melodies and writing lyrics. They used the stools on the stairs of Paul's house or the cramped rooms of Aunt Mimi's house as their first studios. After John Lennon and Paul McCartney's fateful meeting, the band began to evolve, and the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. It wasn't long before a new talent was added to the group. George Harrison, a young guitarist Paul had known from school. Despite his age, he was only a teenager. George impressed John with his guitar skills. The shy but determined young man brought a level of technique that complemented John and Paul's raw energy. Still, something seemed missing. The initial lineup of the Quarrymen went through several changes, and over time the band abandoned its name in favor of something bolder. Inspired by American bands and the spirit of rock and roll, they decided to call themselves the Beatles. The name had a creative twist and a connection to the rhythm they loved so much, the beat. In their early years, the Beatles were still searching for their sound and identity. Then the opportunity arose to play in Hamburg, Germany in 1960. This experience was transformative. Playing for hours on end, night after night, in noisy, smoke-filled clubs, they developed their stamina, skill, and stage charisma. Hamburg was an intense training ground, where the young musicians faced challenges and grew together as a band. Meanwhile, the search for a drummer to complete the lineup led to several changes until, in 1962, Ringo Starr, an experienced and charismatic drummer, joined the group. With Ringo, the chemistry was complete. He brought not only talent, but also a quirky humor that helped balance the strong personalities of John, Paul, and George. The turning point came when local Liverpool impresario Brian Epstein discovered them. Epstein saw something special in the Beatles, something that could go beyond the small clubs and reach a much larger audience. He became the band's mentor, helping to shape their image and connect them with the music industry. In 1962, the Beatles signed a contract with EMI, and under the management of George Martin, they began recording their music. It was at this point that the world began to take notice of the band's extraordinary talent. Their first single, Love Me Do, released in October 1962, was not an immediate hit, but it put the Beatles on the radar. From there, the sky was the limit. Soon, the group was releasing hit after hit, such as Please Please Me and She Loves You. Each performance drew bigger crowds. Each new release sent fans into a frenzy. It was the beginning of Beatlemania, a phenomenon that not only changed music but redefined pop culture. The Beatles were young, charming, and talented, and the whole world wanted a piece of them. Imagine a group of 4 young men from a working-class city like Liverpool becoming the biggest sensation on the planet in just a few years. That's exactly what happened to the Beatles between 1963 and 1966. Beatlemania wasn't just a musical success. It was a cultural phenomenon that transformed the way music was made, the style of youth, and even the way the world viewed fame. It all started with the release of Please Please Me, which quickly climbed the British charts in 1963. The band's catchy melodies and infectious energy won the hearts of fans, and suddenly the Beatles were everywhere. On the radio, on television, on the covers of magazines. The public didn't just like their music. They loved the band as a whole. Each member had a unique charisma. John was the sarcastic and witty one, Paul the romantic and charming one, George the introspective one, and Ringo the funny and friendly one. But it was in 1964 that the phenomenon really exploded. The Beatles crossed the Atlantic and conquered the United States with their historic performance on The Ed Sullivan Show, watched by more than 70 million people. It was as if the entire country had stopped to watch these young British men in elegant suits and long hair, something radical for the time, sing I Want to Hold Your Hand. After that, there was no turning back. The Beatles were a worldwide sensation. The crowds that followed them were unprecedented. Teenagers screamed, cried, and fainted at their performances. In 1965, during a concert at Shea Stadium in New York, more than 55,000 people filled the stadium, a record at the time. The fans' screams were so loud that, at times, the Beatles themselves could not hear the sound of their instruments on stage. And it wasn't just noise. The Beatles were releasing hit after hit. She Loves You became an anthem for the youth, while Help showed a more reflective and vulnerable side of John Lennon, who was beginning to question the weight of fame. Yesterday, a melancholic and timeless ballad, brought a new level of sophistication to the band's songwriting and proved that they were much more than a passing fad. John Lennon, with his sharp wit and quick comebacks, became an unofficial spokesman for the rebellious youth of the time. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind, whether it was about politics, religion, or the music industry itself. Quotes like "We're more popular than Jesus now" sparked controversy, but they also showed his willingness to challenge norms and spark debate. Beatlemania wasn't just about music. The Beatles were setting trends with their mop-top hairstyles and innovative clothing, influencing people's behavior and redefining youth culture. They were unlike anything the world had ever seen, and their popularity was a reflection of the social and cultural changes taking place in the 1960s. But like all great phenomena, Beatlemania came at a cost. The Beatles were starting to feel the weight of their fame. The pressure to produce hits, the constant harassment from fans, and the lack of privacy began to wear on them. Despite this, they continued to create groundbreaking music and inspire millions of people. The rise of Beatlemania was like a comet streaking across the sky, bright, intense, and impossible to ignore. But this was just the beginning of the revolution that the Beatles were about to lead. Want to know how they changed music forever? The story continues. By 1965, something had begun to change for the Beatles. After years of living in the spotlight of Beatlemania, they no longer wanted to simply create catchy songs for the screaming crowds. They wanted to explore, grow, and most of all, defy expectations. It was during this period that the band took a step forward, leaving the comfortable territory of traditional rock and roll to venture into musical and artistic terrain that no one had explored before. It all started with the album Rubber Soul, 1965. With songs like Norwegian Wood and In My Life, the Beatles brought more personal and introspective lyrics, reflecting the complex experiences and emotions of each member. John Lennon, in particular, began to explore deeper themes. His lyrics stopped being simple love stories and became small portraits of his own life and inner questions. Norwegian Wood, for example, mixed humor, melancholy, and even a touch of mystery, showing John's more poetic side. Soon came Revolver, 1966, a landmark in the history of music. This album was an explosion of creativity, both lyrically and musically. Tomorrow Never Knows, written mainly by John, was one of the most innovative songs on the album, with lyrics inspired by the Tibetan Book of the Dead and psychedelic sounds created in the studio that were completely revolutionary for the time. John was increasingly interested in exploring the limits of the mind and music, reflecting his curiosity for philosophy, spirituality, and experimentation. But it was with 1967's Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band that the Beatles reached the pinnacle of their musical maturity. This album was more than just a collection of songs. It was a complete work of art, a sonic journey that delved into different styles and emotions. The idea of the album as a concept came in part from John and Paul's desire to create something that was more than just dance music. They wanted people to listen to it and be transported to another world. During the same period, John wrote one of his most iconic compositions, Strawberry Fields Forever. The song was a deep dive into his childhood memories, inspired by an orphanage near where he grew up, called Strawberry Field. The introspective and almost surreal lyrics captured his unique vision of the world. A place where reality was malleable and imagination had the power to transform everything. Musically, Strawberry Fields Forever was a masterpiece of experimentation. John worked tirelessly with producer George Martin to combine two different versions of the song, creating a unique and innovative sound. Instruments were manipulated in the studio, voices and sounds mixed in ways never before attempted. The result? One of the most memorable and influential songs of all time. During this period, the Beatles began to move away from live performances, which had become chaotic and unfulfilling for them. Instead, they devoted their time to creating music in the studio, using advanced recording techniques and incorporating unconventional instruments such as the Indian sitar, orchestral strings, and even recording backwards. For John, this was the perfect space to explore his creativity and express the ideas that were bubbling inside his head. It was a November evening in 1966 when John Lennon walked into the Indica Gallery, a small art gallery in London. He had heard about an intriguing exhibition by a Japanese artist named Yoko Ono. John wasn't sure what to expect, but curiosity, always a defining characteristic of his personality, led him there. When he entered, he found something very different from what he was used to. Yoko Ono's works were conceptual, challenging, and enigmatic. One piece in particular caught his eye, a ladder leading up to a magnifying glass hanging from the ceiling. When you looked through the magnifying glass, you saw the word yes written at the top. John was intrigued by the simplicity and positivity of the message. He would later say that in a world full of negativity, it was a relief. Yoko Ono was an avant-garde artist with a unique take on art and life. To many she seemed eccentric, but to John she was fascinating. The two began talking and quickly felt a connection. Yoko was not just an artist, she was a thinker, someone who challenged convention and encouraged John to do the same. She asked him questions no one else had ever asked, and he felt he could be completely honest with her. At the time, John was married to Cynthia Lennon, his first wife, and he was going through a transitional period in his life. Beatlemania was on the wane, and he was looking for something beyond music to express who he really was. Yoko emerged as a transformative force, encouraging John to explore new forms of art, including performance art and experimental film. Together they became an inseparable creative duo. But the relationship was not without controversy. When John and Yoko began appearing together in public, many Beatles fans were not happy. Some saw Yoko as an interloper in the Beatles world, accusing her of causing tension within the band. The media was also unkind, often ridiculing Yoko and downplaying her role as an artist. Despite all the outside pressure, John was resolute. He always said that Yoko was his other half, someone who not only understood him but also challenged him to be the best version of himself. John's music began to reflect this new phase of his life. Songs like Julia and later, The Ballad of John and Yoko showed the profound impact Yoko had on his art. In addition, the couple began to use their visibility to promote causes they believed in. Together, they became peace activists, organizing events like the famous Bed-Ins for Peace, where they would spend days in a hotel bed, hosting journalists and discussing global issues like the Vietnam War. For John, Yoko was more than a muse or a partner, she was a comrade in arms. Meeting Yoko Ono marked a turning point in John Lennon's life. It was an encounter that brought love, inspiration, and, yes, controversy. But for John, it was the discovery of a new purpose, one that transcended music and became a commitment to art, peace, and authenticity. This chapter of his life, while challenging, was a testament to his courage to follow his heart, even when it meant facing the judgment of the entire world. Want to know how this love and partnership influenced the final years of his career? The story is not over yet. Let's continue. The end of the Beatles, the last chord of the greatest band in the world. The split began to take shape in the late 1960s. As the Beatles matured, their creative visions began to diverge. John Lennon, who had always been the band's informal leader, was increasingly involved with Yoko Ono and sought to explore new forms of artistic expression. Paul McCartney wanted to maintain the classic sound and essence of the band, while George Harrison felt that his creative contributions were not being valued. Ringo Starr, although more neutral, also felt the weight of the disputes. Furthermore, the death of Brian Epstein, the manager who had guided the Beatles through their glory years, left a void that the band was never able to fill. Without Epstein, business decisions led to conflict, especially when the members could not agree on who should take over management of the band. In 1969, during the recording of the album Let It Be, tensions were more evident than ever. The atmosphere in the studio was tense, marked by arguments and frustrations. Despite this, the Beatles still managed to produce memorable songs such as Let It Be and The Long and Winding Road. But the harmony that had united them for so long was no longer there. The last album recorded by the Beatles was Abbey Road in 1969, which featured classics such as Come Together and Something. Although the album was a success, the relationship between the members was already at breaking point. John in particular was ready to move on. In 1970, the breakup was official. The announcement shocked fans, but for John Lennon, it was a liberation. He felt that the Beatles had served their purpose and that it was time to move on to something new. As he put it was like we were trapped in a marriage that no longer worked. Shortly after the band broke up, John embarked on his solo career. His first album, John Lennon/Plastic Ono Band, released in 1970, was an honest and raw portrayal of his thoughts and emotions. The album reflected his experience with primal scream therapy, a technique he and Yoko Ono had experimented with to deal with past trauma. Songs like Mother addressed the pain of his childhood, while Working Class Hero was a scathing critique of society. John used his music to explore themes that he had never addressed with the Beatles. He was no longer bound by expectations of pleasing an audience. He could now be completely true to himself. This creative freedom led to some of his most heartfelt and powerful work. The end of the Beatles was the end of an era, but for John Lennon, it was also the beginning of a new era. He traded the security of being part of the biggest band in the world for a more personal and often challenging journey. It was a bold decision, but one that allowed him to continue to evolve as an artist and as a human being. After the breakup of the Beatles, John Lennon found his voice in a whole new way, and it resonated around the world like never before. In 1971, he released the album Imagine, and with it, the title track that would become not only his most famous song, but also a universal anthem for peace. Imagine was more than a song. It was a powerful message, an invitation to dream of a world where there was no division, war, or greed. John wrote Imagine at his home with Yoko Ono by his side. He drew inspiration from Yoko's ideas and his own ideals of a simpler, more united world. The lyrics asked people to imagine a place without borders, without religions that separate, and without material possessions that cause inequality. It was an invitation to see beyond differences and believe in the possibility of a better world. Musically, Imagine was simple, almost minimalist, with John's piano guiding the melody. This simplicity was what made the song so powerful. It was easy to sing, easy to understand, but hard to ignore. Released amid the political and social turmoil of the 1970s, it quickly became a symbol of the fight for peace. John also got involved in protests, donated money to peace organizations, and used his music as a platform for activism. Give Peace a Chance, recorded at one of the bed-ins, became one of the anthems of the anti-war movement. He and Yoko participated in marches and campaigns, never hesitating to use their fame as a tool for change. Behind it all was a simple truth. John believed in the power of people. For him, peace was not an unattainable utopia, but something that could begin with small changes in the way people related to each other. Imagine was the embodiment of this belief, a song that invited each individual to dream together and make that dream a reality. Of course, not everyone saw John as a hero. He faced criticism, was called an idealist, and even became the target of investigations by the US government, which saw his activism as a threat. But that didn't stop him. On the contrary, John used these adversities as fuel to keep fighting. Imagine remains one of John Lennon's greatest legacies to this day. It is a song that spans generations, resonating in times of conflict and moments of hope. It encapsulates John's dream, a dream that he shared with the world and that in many ways lives on. In the early 1970s, John Lennon and Yoko Ono decided to start over in New York, a vibrant city full of diversity and energy. For John, New York was a creative haven, a place where he could escape the pressures of his former life as a Beatle and explore his identity as an artist, activist, and human being. But the move also brought new challenges, including an intense battle with the US government. As soon as they arrived, John and Yoko immersed themselves in the city's cultural and political scene. New York was teeming with social and countercultural movements, from protests against the Vietnam War to struggles for civil rights and gender equality. For John, who had already found his voice as an activist, it was the perfect place to use his fame and influence to advance important causes. John's connection to the city was instant. He loved the freedom that New York offered. He could walk the streets with less harassment than he had faced in England and connect with artists, musicians, and social movement leaders. He settled into the iconic Dakota Building, located near Central Park, which became his home and a symbol of his new phase of life. But John and Yoko's arrival in the United States did not go unnoticed by the government. Their political views, especially their criticism of the Vietnam War and their support for revolutionary movements, caught the attention of the FBI and then-President Richard Nixon. The government feared that John would use his popularity to mobilize young people against Nixon in the 1972 election. As a result, John faced a grueling legal battle when authorities attempted to deport him under the pretext of a visa problem related to an old drug conviction in England. For 4 years, John fought to remain in the United States. He hired lawyers, gave interviews, and continued to be vocal about his struggle, transforming his own experience into a symbol of resistance against political repression. In 1976, he finally won permanent residency in the United States, marking the end of a long and exhausting battle. Despite these difficulties, the period in New York was incredibly productive for John. He released albums such as Sometime in New York City, 1972, which directly addressed political and social issues, and participated in benefit events and concerts supporting causes such as Native American rights and the release of unjustly imprisoned activists. New York was also a place where John experienced moments of introspection and personal transformation. After the birth of his son Sean in 1975, he decided to step away from music for a while to focus on fatherhood. He wanted to be the kind of present father he had never had, and this period of retreat marked a pause in his public life. John's relationship with New York was more than geographic. It was emotional. He often described the city as his spiritual home, a place that offered him the freedom to be himself, away from the stifling expectations of his former life. New York was the setting for some of the most challenging and transformative moments in John Lennon's life. It was where he found his voice as an activist, faced the brunt of political opposition, and experienced a new sense of personal and artistic freedom. But it was also the place where his story would come to a tragic end. The years away from music were transformative for John. He learned to cook, spent hours caring for Sean, and enjoyed simple moments like taking his son for walks in Central Park. For a man who had lived through the frenzy of Beatlemania and faced legal and political battles, this respite offered a calm he had never experienced before. He often said he was rediscovering what was important in life. Yet even during this quiet period, music never completely disappeared from his mind. John continued to play the piano and guitar at home, composing melodies casually. He had been waiting for the right moment, and the right inspiration, to return. In 1980, with Sean old enough to understand the world around him, John felt it was time to return. He and Yoko began working together on the album Double Fantasy, a celebration of their love, their family, and the new chapter in their lives. The album's title was inspired by a flower John had seen in a garden, something that symbolized to him the beauty of two people growing together. Double Fantasy was a deeply personal project. With songs like, Just Like, Starting Over, John expressed the optimism of starting over, while on Beautiful Boy, Darling Boy, he expressed all the love and pride he felt for Sean. The music was soft, mature, and full of hope, reflecting the state of mind of a man who, for the first time in years, felt he had found a balance between his personal life and his art. The album was also a collaborative effort between him and Yoko, with tracks alternating between the two, showing how deeply their lives and creativity were intertwined. Double Fantasy was not just a return to music. It was a declaration of who John Lennon had become, a peaceful man, passionate about his family and ready to share his new perspective with the world. John's return was greeted with enthusiasm by fans. He gave interviews where he seemed happier and more at peace than ever. He spoke about his future plans, including a possible tour, something he hadn't done since the Beatles. He was full of ideas, with renewed creative energy and a determination to continue his artistic journey. Double Fantasy was released in November 1980, and the world celebrated the return of one of music's greatest icons. John was ready for a new beginning, to explore new horizons and to continue being an influential voice in a world that still needed his message of peace and love. But tragically, this new chapter in his life was cut short in an abrupt and painful way. John Lennon's return to music and his rediscovery of happiness as a father and artist left an everlasting mark, showing the world that even after years of turmoil he had found his way. On the night of December 8, 1980, the world lost one of its greatest icons. John Lennon, a man who had dedicated his life to music, art and the fight for a better world, was murdered outside the Dakota Building, where he lived with Yoko Ono and their son Sean in New York. Mark David Chapman, an obsessed fan, took John's life in a brutal and senseless way, leaving the world in shock and mourning. That morning, John had spent the day working in the studio with Yoko, finishing yet another musical project. When they returned to the Dakota, Chapman was already waiting. Earlier he had asked John for an autograph on a copy of the Double Fantasy album, and John, as was his custom, kindly obliged. But hours later, Chapman committed the act that would mark one of the saddest nights in music history. The news of John Lennon's death spread quickly, leaving millions of fans around the world devastated. For many, it was more than the loss of a musician. It was the loss of a voice that represented hope, love and the fight for a better world. Spontaneous tributes erupted across the globe, with crowds gathering to sing his songs, share memories and mourn the untimely passing of one of the greatest artists of all time. At 40 years old, John Lennon left an immeasurable legacy. From Liverpool to the world, he gave us songs that transcend generations, from Beatles classics to his solo compositions such as Imagine, which continues to be a beacon of hope in difficult times. He showed us that music can be more than entertainment. It can be a tool for change, for connection and for imagining a better world. And so ends the story of John Lennon, a journey of rebellion, passion and purpose, marked by moments of glory and a tragic end that the world will never forget. But John's legacy is not only in his past. It lives on in every note, every word and in every person who dares to imagine a better world. If you enjoyed this story and want to continue exploring the lives and impact of great personalities, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below with who you would like to be the next protagonist of a story as fascinating as this one. And remember, music can change the world just as it changed the lives of John Lennon and the lives of millions of fans around the world. Thank you for watching, and until next time.